Yeah, and I'll make them recommend.
Okay. All right, so if everybody takes their seats, we'll begin. There's a little saying in England that you tell when you're about to tell a bedtime story to the children. You say, "Are you sitting comfortably?" And they say yes. And then you say, "Then I'll begin." So hopefully they're sitting comfortably. And Eric is here. Good. Hi, Eric. Today we're going to be discussing disability rights from a national and international perspective. Professor Crowley is going to be doing the moderating. I will just begin by welcoming you, and I know you particularly with the first two sessions, which were very high profile, particularly the first one, that the students got a little bit ignored. That wasn't intentional, but sometimes we like to start off with a big bang, and we did. So both on the international tobacco litigation and on Zika virus, things were off to a good start. I know that Professor Crowley talked to you last week. I'll just give you just a few minutes of my own perspective, and then without further ado, I'll hand it off to Professor Crowley to introduce our two magnificent panelists today. But as he may have told you, the idea here is to have students able to engage with thought leaders around the country who are talking about the intersection of law, health, international affairs, political science, to give you a really good taste of what the national and international health policy and law issues are, to have you ask questions. We really want to encourage the students to actually take the forefront, to ask those questions, to be fully engaged in these conversations. And then we're going to be you've got the syllabus. The syllabus basically outlines each of the areas that we're going to discuss through the weeks. It's extremely important for you to do all of the reading in advance so that you're fully informed and engaged and are able to take the conversation forward. As we progress, we're going to talk more about the assignment and the grading and what we expect in terms of good writing. I know that both Professor Crowley and I have very clear ideas about how to make you as good a writer as you can be, and we're going to really focus on that and the writing skills and work with you. And both him and I, and of course Anna, are available to you anytime to talk about the class generally, or about a particular speaker, or about the paper, or whatever it might be. Welcome to day 3 of the colloquium, and then I'm very pleased to be handing this over to Professor Crowley to talk more about what today's session is going to be like and our speakers.
Thanks, Eric. And also, just to add to what he just said, I understand there's some questions about the deadline. So the deadlines in the syllabus really are for the 3-credit paper, which I think none of you want. So you want the paper at the end. I don't think you should be deciding what your topic is yet, because we really want you to reflect on something you heard over the course of the semester, right? And we will say more about that later. Some of the standard advice every week, Anna gives me this to make sure I read to you, but it is important that I read it to you. All sessions, including breaks, are recorded and live streamed. So even at the break, if you're going to say something here, it could be picked up on the mic. So remember that. If you want something that isn't picked up on the mic, you may want to go outside. Make sure you sign in. We track attendance. And we ask you to use the table attendance. We were just given today a sheet with your names and faces, and we're going to try to learn your faces and your names, but we don't know them all yet, so that'll help us. I'm really excited about this week's session on disability rights and disability policy at the international and domestic level. We actually have two great speakers. I want to tell you, though, about the third speaker we don't have, and that is Henry Claypool. He's a good friend of mine. I told you last week that I was in the administration and I coordinated disability policy at the White House. He was my main counterpart at the Department of Health and Human Services, where he was the disability policy advisor to Secretary of Civilians. We actually go back way further. Like he's literally one of my closest friends, but we're close colleagues. But I also said last week that we strive over the course of the semester to give you a diversity of different people, and planning a disability session, we really wouldn't have had a session without a person with a disability here. Henry is a person with a disability, but unfortunately he couldn't make it this week. But it wasn't just that we didn't think about that aspect of our representation, but we do have two great people and that we're going to hear from. And so I think we'll all have a great conversation anyway. The first person I want to introduce is Eve Hill, who's a nationally known disability rights advocate and expert on disability rights. She's currently the Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Justice. She's a member of the Civil Rights Division's leadership team, and she's responsible for oversight of the division's disability rights enforcement, educational civil rights enforcement, Title VI interagency coordination, and the American Indian Working Group. She's also a personal friend of mine, and I actually take great pride in seeing her personally, because a lot of people I interact only professionally. And sometimes when you're seeing people personally, you hear about some of the battles. And as we talk about how lawyers can affect policy change, we sometimes savor the victory, but often to get there is really frustrating. And to affect change, it's not like everybody says, "Oh, that's a great idea." It's often really a hard slog. And she's someone that I've seen, because I hear about what keeps her up at night. Someone committed to the fight, and I'm really proud of her. She has a longer history of working on these issues. Also, she does work internationally. She worked on the negotiating team for the Marrakesh Treaty to facilitate access to published works for persons who are blind, visually impaired, or otherwise print disabled. She testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to support the ratification of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So she's not solely domestic and has that broader perspective as well. So I'm really excited to hear from you. Then we're going to hear from Eric Rosenthal, who's the founder and the executive director of Disability Rights International, which he founded in 1993. He's a trained human rights and disability activist, or he's trained disability and human rights activists, and provided assistance to governments and international development organizations worldwide. He's worked in more than 25 countries. I will stop here. He has a much longer bio that we can share, but the other point I would make is when I try to say, oh, there's these great things you can do and there's different ways that you can change the world, he's also a Georgetown Law grad. So, you can follow in his footsteps. So I'm not going to say much more, but I'm really excited to have both of them, and I think we'll start with you, Eve.
Are we sitting or standing?
I think maybe standing by the mic. If you prefer to sit, that's fine. We'll go there for the Q&A.
Intimidating podium. It's bigger than I am. And I always tell my students, stand when you're speaking, because you project better. So thanks for having me here. I'm really happy to talk to you all. I love law students, because even if you're not going to be a disability rights attorney, which so few of us get the opportunity to do, but I know you all want to, but you're going to go do something else, disability comes up in almost everything you do. And I like infiltration. So when you go advise your clients, you could advise them on the right way to handle ADA issues. And Jeff's comment about working at the DOJ, I've worked at a lot of different places. Nonprofits, think tanks, city government, on and on and on. It sounds like I can't keep a job, but I really don't. Or I will eventually someday. But DOJ is one of those places where, in all those things, in any sort of advocacy role, you're beating your head against the wall a lot. And at DOJ, the great thing is you beat your head against the wall, and then the wall falls down. So you get to do things like we did a week or so ago when we said, we're not going to use private prisons anymore. That was a big wall, and that wall came down. And so that's one of the great joys about doing the same things I've always been doing, advocating and pushing and beating my heads against the wall. But then the wall goes away. It's pretty impressive. So we enforce Titles 2 and 3 of the Americans with Disabilities Act. We only enforce Title I, the employment provisions, against state and local government employers, and only after the EEOC refers them to us. So I'm going to focus mostly today on what we do and how we think about our Title II and Title III requirements of the ADA. And those cover state and local governments, that's Title II, and public accommodations like restaurants and businesses and schools, private schools, under Title III. So the ADA, unlike most of the disability-related laws in the US, is focused on civil rights. It's a civil rights law. Its goal is just equal opportunity. It's not charity, it's not benefits, it's not pity, it's not special treatment, it's not health care really, although we have aligned it with health care to some extent, and it's not affirmative action. It's our attempt to shift from a medical, charity, pity-based model of disability that says, oh, those poor people, let me give them $1 or a dime, and get them more healthcare treatment. Maybe we can cure them. To okay, here's who I am. I have a disability, and I do too. You do have a speaker with a disability. It's just not obvious. I have a disability. This is who I am. I want to be able to participate in everything that everybody else can participate. How can we make that happen? So it sort of sets a floor of equal opportunity that other laws and other programs can then supplement, can then provide affirmative action or benefits or supports and other things. So it recognizes that what we're aiming for is equality, but we've gotten very careful and clear about the fact that equality doesn't mean same. So people with disabilities are different from people without disabilities in that one respect. In every other respect, they're different from everybody else, just like everybody else is different from everybody else. And that people with disabilities aren't the same as each other either. So we don't say you treat people with disabilities exactly the same way you treat people without disabilities, but you treat them in a way that recognizes the disability. You treat them so they have an equal opportunity. And the ADA applies across everything. Just about every aspect of daily life the ADA applies to. It covers everything from the streets, to the restaurants, to the police, to the trash pickup, and on and on and on and on and on. So we couldn't have a rule that would apply this way in this situation, so a rule for all restaurants, and a rule for all police, and a rule for all streets, and a rule for all trash pickup. So we have broad, overarching concepts that then play out in different ways depending on the context. And those basic concepts are, the definition of disability is very broad, really, really broad, because all it requires is equal opportunity. It doesn't require extra stuff. You don't get a cash payment under the ADA for having a disability. You don't get special treatment, you don't get affirmative action, you just get fair treatment, and really everybody's entitled to that. So who's covered under the ADA is really very broad. Then the basic concepts of the requirements are physical access. Things have to be physically accessible. There are standards about what that means, and they apply differently depending on whether a facility is pre-existing the ADA, has been altered since the ADA, or is newly constructed since the ADA. New ones have to be fully accessible. Old ones have to gradually make their way towards accessibility. One of the big concepts is reasonable modification or reasonable accommodation. You have to change things. You have to change your policies, procedures, or practices. Even if it's just, well, it's just the way we always do it. You may have to change that for a person with a disability if it's necessary for them to participate. And then equally effective communication. What I say to a person without a disability, I have to be able to communicate it effectively, equally effectively, to a person without a disability. And that's by providing auxiliary aids, sign language interpreters, or braille, or handwritten notes, or whatever it will take to communicate the idea as effectively as I would with people without disabilities. And we say, no, it's only equally as effectively. If you're a terrible communicator, you can communicate terribly with people with disabilities. You don't have to be better at it, but you have to get the point across as well as you do for everyone else. And then, of course, the basic one that people tend to forget somehow, you can't just exclude people with disabilities or give them worse services or less whatever than you do everybody else. And finally, you can't unnecessarily segregate people with disabilities. And this responds to our long history of saying, well, you're so special that we're going to have a separate program for you, and you're going to live there and work there and spend all your time there, and we're never going to see you again, and we're going to forget all about you, and you'll be taken care of there. So it takes away all access to everything and says all the people with disabilities are special. You'll only interact with other people with disabilities. We won't know anything about you. You won't learn from us. And that's turned out to be pretty dangerous for people with disabilities. And I'll talk more about that. And then there are defenses, undue burden, if it's really too hard, fundamental alteration, if it changes the program completely, and direct threat, if the person's actually objectively a danger, which is a very small defense. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the sort of the breadth of the things that we deal with under the ADA, the Civil Rights Division. Let me tell you, disability discrimination is alive and well. From the really classically, oh my goodness, how could that possibly have happened? How did anybody think that was okay kind of discrimination, to the things that are a little more subtle, and you can see why they maybe thought that was the right way to do it, but it just wasn't the right way to do it. So the clear ones, we've taken on things like physical access. One of the latest big settlements was with Carnival Cruise Lines, which refused to make accessible cabins available to people with mobility impairments. Didn't design any accessible cabins. If they had accessible cabins, they wouldn't reserve them or assign them to people with physical impairments. So I would get the great physically accessible cabin, and someone who used a wheelchair would get the little tiny one down the hall. So we reached a settlement agreement requiring 62 ships to be made accessible. And Carnival will pay $400,000 in civil penalties and damages for people who got excluded from accessible rooms. Then we're dealing with technology. This is kind of a new area, and this is an effective communication case. Developing technologies are a huge opportunity to make the world accessible. As we now access everything online, you can't really go to your teller anymore at the bank. You really do everything online. As those things are made available, they offer a tremendous opening up of the world to people with disabilities, but only if they're built accessibly. If they're not built accessibly, then people mostly with communication disabilities like hearing impairments or vision impairments still have to go to the teller. They're the only person left who has to go to the teller, but they have to go. And worse than that, in education, as everything's offered online, as you use learning management systems to submit your homework, as you do all your reading through electronic means, as you look at videos, and on and on and on, people with disabilities are completely excluded from those and have to pay the more expensive way of getting everything. We have to buy the book. We have to go talk to the teacher. We have to go make them accessible ourselves, and so on and so forth. So while there's a huge opportunity for accessible technology, without accessibility being built in, it leaves people with disabilities further behind than we might have. So recently we worked with edX, which is a massive, literally massive MOOC, massive open online course, to make their platform accessible and the content that goes on that platform accessible. And that will make hundreds and thousands, I think, of courses available to people with disabilities across the country. We still face flat-out stigma-based discrimination. Oh, we don't know if we want you here at all. So we settled with the Louisiana Bar, which would ask you if you had any kind of mental disability, and if you did, make you turn over your medical records, basically, to other lawyers in your community who would then review them, and they would decide whether you were a little scary. Can we really trust you to take care of other people's money and go to court and represent people? And they would put people on what was called conditional admission. So you would have oversight for several years where some other lawyer would get to review all your cases, review all your files, talk to your employer, ask them about your mental health, and on and on and on. It was very, very restrictive. So we made them stop doing that. They can't ask those questions, they can't get that information, they can't give that kind of oversight based on just the fact that you had depression or bipolar. So those are the kinds of things we face with particularly mental health disabilities. Stigma, flat out, triggers people and makes them get overprotective, which results in exclusion. And then employment. We still find a lot of professions where they think they have to exclude people with disabilities, all kinds of disabilities. So we recently reached a settlement with the Riverside County police department, sheriff's department, where they refused to hire someone who had controlled epilepsy. It had been controlled for years. He'd been a law enforcement officer for years. He hadn't had any problems. And they just said, oh, no, you have this. We won't follow up. We won't ask you any more questions. You're out. So they had to pay him $50,000 and give him a job. And then healthcare. Now, if people with disabilities need access to anything, it's a doctor, as we all do at some point in our life. So we see discrimination in healthcare so often, we decided to put together an initiative. It's called the Barrier-Free Healthcare Initiative. And we have something like 72 U.S. attorneys' offices partnering with us on these, which takes complaints about discrimination in healthcare. And this is effective communication. Deaf people get discriminated against in healthcare all the time. People won't take them as patients because they won't provide an interpreter or even write handwritten notes for the simple things. HIV. People are excluded from healthcare for regular things. I have a cold. Won't you help me treat my cold? No, because you have HIV. And physical access. Doctors' offices are shockingly inaccessible to people with disabilities, which just doesn't fit with the business model at all. But we've reached 7 agreements under that initiative just this year. But there are also some more subtle kinds of discrimination that we deal with. One of the issues we've been dealing with a lot lately is parenting. Healthcare professionals, child welfare professionals, foster care and adoption agencies have certain preconceptions about people with disabilities as the possibility of them being parents. And so we found the National Council on Disability issued a report that noted that people with disabilities were significantly overrepresented in the child welfare system that took their children away, often right at the hospital when a baby is born. So stories like the blind parents who wanted some help learning to breastfeed the baby, and because they couldn't immediately do it themselves, the hospital called child welfare and had the baby taken away. We dealt with one case in Massachusetts where we saw that same kind of bias happening. And in this case, it was a woman with intellectual disabilities. And she had a child, and because she couldn't do whatever they asked her to do in the hospital without someone showing her how to do it, they took her baby away immediately. And they kept it for 2 years. And they didn't care that she had parents at home that were going to live with her and help take care of the baby, take legal custody of the baby as well. They wouldn't provide the reunification services that they're supposed to provide to everyone. They would make her go places to see the baby and demonstrate that she could do the things that they wanted her to do, instead of letting the baby come to her. They limited her ability to interact with the baby, so she couldn't get used to things and bond with the baby in a way other parents were. And they didn't follow their own procedures, which said you were supposed to make more services available to parents with disabilities who need it in order to meet the requirements that you've set on them. So they kept that baby away for more than 2 years. As a result of our letter of findings in that case, the baby is now reunited with her mom and her grandparents, and they're doing quite well. But that assumption that, a person with an intellectual disability couldn't possibly raise a child was so pervasive that they couldn't see their way around it, even to do what their policies told them to do. So we're actually investigating cases like that across the country. And because we are investigating cases like that across the country, we felt the need to issue some guidance to remind child welfare agencies, courts who are involved in child welfare and adoption and foster care agencies, that they also can't discriminate on the basis of disability, and pointing out to them some of the ways that they might be acting that we would consider discriminatory, not providing the same services they do for others, taking children away based on an assumption about a disability, and so forth. So that guidance is hopefully cutting off some of those prejudgments that child welfare agencies are making. We're also dealing a lot with accessible transportation, which I had thought was one of the easy ones. You get buses with lifts, you make stations accessible, you're all good. We share responsibility for transportation with the Department of Transportation, but we have our own obligations under there. And transportation is incredibly key to people with disabilities accessing everything else. If you can't get there, you can't access the services. So it doesn't really matter if the restaurant is accessible if you can't get there. And most people can't afford the modified vehicles that you would need to drive yourself. Access services, the paratransit systems are hard to get eligibility for and are not, almost universally, the disability community would say they're not reliable. They get you there late or early. One of my employees used to have to get to work 2 hours early, which is great for me, not so good for her. But these were not reliable. Public transportation could answer this question. But things happened like Greyhound was supposed to make all its buses accessible by quite some time ago, in addition to accommodating people, making sure the lifts work, making sure that, you know those signs that say reserved seating for people with disabilities? Making sure you actually let the people with disabilities sit there and not use those seats for the driver's bag. Over and over and over again, we were seeing those complaints. So we reached a settlement with Greyhound to make sure that all its facilities are accessible, its lifts are maintained and checked regularly and fixed when they're broken, that they allow people with disabilities to get on and off at the rest stops. That was another big problem. The bus driver would say, oh, we only have 15 minutes at the rest stop. You don't get to pee because I'm not going to let you off the bus. And failing to allow people to make their reservations online. If you used a wheelchair and needed an accessible bus, they would make you make a phone call. They would say, well, I guess this bus will be accessible. It wouldn't turn out to be accessible. You would be stuck at the station halfway between where you were coming from and where you were going. So they have to address all those things. Plus, they have a multi-million-dollar settlement fund for people who've experienced Greyhound discrimination on the basis of disability. That's still open now for people to input their experiences and get compensatory damages for those. And then we also recently issued a letter of findings against Amtrak. Amtrak was supposed to make all its stations accessible by 2010. Well, it's 2016, and we found that only 5% of its stations are actually accessible. That's 18 out of 400. Good job. Close. So we're working with them to either negotiate a settlement to make the accessibility that's supposed to happen, or to sue them and get an order to do that. I talked a little bit about technology. It's just so important. But when the ADA was passed, we weren't thinking about the internet. It barely existed. So there wasn't a standard built into that. What standard of accessibility do we have to apply? So that's a little flexible right now. We're working on rulemaking to set out what the standard of accessibility is for electronic communications. But we're still enforcing the law to meet general accessibility standards. So we reached a settlement with Louisiana Tech University. Louisiana Tech University had used an online learning system that was completely inaccessible to a blind student, and as a result he had to drop out of the class, and they put him in another class using the same online learning system, which he still couldn't get access to. So as a result of that settlement, they're only going to purchase accessible technology from now on. They're going to check it first, and if their contractor who's going to sell them the technology can't swear that it's accessible, they won't buy it. And if it turns out not to be accessible, the contractor has to fix it and indemnify them against any claims that they may get. We also settled with Peapod, the online grocery delivery, so that their website, which is the whole face of their business, is accessible so people can order groceries online. And think about it, so you're blind and you don't have a car, you can't drive, and your transportation, as I mentioned, unreliable. This would be a great way to get your groceries, except, oh well, that's not accessible either. And then we've started to try on a sort of global way, a global approach, when we look at online employment systems. Now this is the way most people get jobs these days, is an online application, and those are often not accessible. So we periodically do reviews of employers' online application systems to make sure they're not asking pre-employment questions that they're not allowed to ask. You're not allowed to ask people, do you have a disability, when they apply, because that's been shown to really screen out people with disabilities. But But it's a lot like asking that question if your website is not accessible and people have to apply in a whole different way. It screams, this person has a disability, and they somehow get lost in the process. So we're making them both stop asking those questions and make their online application systems accessible. And then we have a project called Project Civic Access, which reviews whole cities, physical accessibility, program accessibility, policy accessibility, and now website accessibility. So as we go to a city, we'll make their website accessible. As I mentioned, we're dealing with doctors all the time who are keeping out people who are deaf, who are keeping out people with HIV, who are inaccessible, and so we reach settlements over and over again where people are denied effective communication in really crucial situations like giving birth, dealing with a loved one who's deaf and having a psychiatric crisis, on and on. And then some of my favorite things to talk about are these really transformative approaches that we're using. You may have heard about Olmsted. Olmsted is really just a Supreme Court case, that said that the ADA's integration mandate, which says public entities have to serve people with disabilities in the most integrated setting that's appropriate for the person, not the most convenient setting that's appropriate for you, the government, not where you've always served people with disabilities, but in the way you serve everybody else. So you and I get to go to our regular doctor down the street for whatever we need taken care of. But a person with a psychiatric disability would be sent to a psychiatric hospital. A person with an intellectual disability would be sent to what's called an ICF, Intermediate Care Facility, which is all people with an intellectual and developmental disabilities. They stay there for years and years and years, and completely segregated. And nursing homes are also segregated settings for people with disabilities. And while we might think of nursing homes as being for elderly people, they're not. Lots of younger people are put in nursing homes because community-based services are not available to them in their own homes. So Olmsted said, no, that stuff that Congress wrote, that means something. That means you have to serve people in the most integrated setting. And so that looked at state systems and said, the only services you offer for severe and persistent mental illness is in your psychiatric facilities. That can't be the most integrated setting for everybody. Surely some of those people could be served at home or with a local mental health provider and so forth. All your people with intellectual disabilities are served in ICFMRs. Some of those people clearly could be served at home. All the services we found that are provided in psychiatric hospitals and ICFs and nursing homes, there's nothing magical about that place that makes those services possible. Those services can be provided anywhere. You can provide nursing services in someone's house. You can provide mental health services in a local community office. You can provide all kinds of things in the community so that people don't have to live there and spend all their time there and never interact with people without disabilities. So far, since 1999, although most of this has been since 2009, we've worked on over 40 cases in 25 states under this Olmsted. I think it's 26 now. So some of the recent stuff has been Florida. Florida keeps several hundred children with, who are medically fragile. They have a variety of disabilities. And they keep them in nursing homes. And I don't mean special kids nursing homes. They keep them in the nursing homes where the elders are. They spend a lot of their time sitting in the hallway, waiting for bingo to start. This is not an appropriate placement for them. And there isn't any reason that the services they need couldn't be provided actually in their homes. So we've sued Florida. Florida is resistant to this, and so we're in actual litigation on that one. We also just recently issued a letter of findings laying out problems with South Dakota's system, where they put people in nursing homes, people of all ages and with all kinds of disabilities, because they don't provide the services in the community. And this is our first case addressing physical disabilities in nursing homes. We're really challenging the idea that disability associated with age is different from disability at younger ages. If those services can be provided in their homes, people should have access to those services in their homes. And we find that almost everybody, no matter their age, would rather get their services in their homes than in a nursing home, often really far from their homes. So we're still working on that one. And then we noticed that we would hear, oh, well, you closed these institutions in X state, and now everybody lives in a group home or in their own home, but the van comes around every day and picks them up and takes them to a sheltered workshop for the whole rest of the day. So yes, they're integrated in the community for the 10 hours in which most people are asleep, but during the day, when everyone's awake, they're still going to these places where there are only other people with disabilities, and those are called sheltered workshops or facility-based day programs. And sheltered workshops are a little bit scary on a number of levels. They were an initial way that society thought we could give people's families a break, that people would have somewhere to go during the day while their families went to work. But the model has changed now. We now know that people with disabilities can work in real jobs, doing the same things that we all do. These sheltered workshops gave people really simple factory-like tasks, putting buttons in bags. If you buy earrings, they're often on the little card, putting the backs of the earrings on the little card over and over again, and they paid below minimum wage because there's a loophole in the Fair Labor Standards Act that allows that. So as low as 2 cents an hour for this very boring work, and people never left. They stayed there for their entire working life. So we took that on in Rhode Island and again in Oregon to tell states you can't just do employment services for people with disabilities in institutions any more than you can just do psychiatric services or other health services just in nursing homes and psych facilities. And transformed those systems so that they now provide the same supports, job coaching, modeling, peer supports in real jobs in the community at or above minimum wage. And we keep hearing these great stories. If you go to our website, ada.gov/Olmsted, there's a section called Faces of Olmsted that shows how people's lives have changed since they've gotten out of sheltered workshops. And it's amazing. They do exactly the same things you and I would do after we graduate. They get married, they buy a car, they get their driver's license, they get parking tickets, all this, they buy a bed for their dog, it's all this regular stuff that's just like what we all do. So I find those cases really helpful. And just a few weeks ago, we sued the state of Georgia again. Olmsted, the original case, came out of Georgia. Georgia learns slowly. So we sued them for segregation in their education system. And this is our first Olmsted education case. They take all their kids with behavioral disabilities and put them in what's called GNETs, the Georgia Network for Educational and Therapeutic Supports, which are separate schools and then sometimes separate classes, but separate schools, often the black schools from the Jim Crow area. So you can imagine how great the facilities are there. All kids with disabilities, no kids without disabilities, all day, every day, often learning online with no actual teachers, supposedly getting provided mental health supports and very limited extracurriculars. So we said, excuse us, those are both separate and unequal. And separate alone is a violation, and unequal is an additional violation. So that case is underway, and it's going to be challenging because it's the first. They're always challenging, but I think it's extremely righteous. And Jeff wants me to stop talking, but I don't care. I have one more thing. This is my favorite thing. Law enforcement. You may read in the paper about some of our stuff in Ferguson and Baltimore and Cleveland and around the country about policing and overreactions of police and discriminatory policing based on race. And the media really picks up on the race part. But some of the people who are most affected by overreactions by police and by problems in the criminal justice system are people with disabilities. So people with mental illness represent probably over 25% of the people shot and killed by police every year. And that's hugely out of proportion with the number of people with mental illness in our society. People with mental illness represent between 14.5% and 31% of people in jails and prisons across the country. And that's 4 to 6 times their representation in the general population. Some states have more than 10 times more people with serious mental illness in jail than they do in psychiatric hospitals or treatment. So what's happening here? And what does the ADA have to say about this, and how do we pull all this together? So we suggest that when a person is in a mental health crisis, they don't need a cop car. They may need a doctor. They may need a timeout. They may need a sandwich. We actually had that case. But we've failed to invest in those services for them. And instead, we've invested in criminalization and thought that would answer the problem. Again, it's kind of the idea that, well, we'll put them over there and we won't have to deal with them anymore. That's not true. They're coming back. Everybody gets out. Shall we get them out in a way that lets them participate in our community or not? And we're learning now that the expenses of jailing people versus providing community-based mental health are way out of whack. Serve people in their communities, they keep paying their own rent instead of us paying their rent. They keep paying for their own food instead of the prison system paying for the food. Medicaid will pay for their services instead of the prison system paying for their services. So we're really looking at now all these threads of how police are supposed to react to people with disabilities under the ADA, how reasonable modifications of their practices can prevent over-arrest of people with disabilities, can prevent killing people with disabilities unnecessarily, can prevent suicide by cop. We're looking at how prosecutors and courts can divert people who will be better served in the long run by treatment than by jail. We're looking at prison treatment of people with disabilities. Solitary confinement is overused on people with disabilities more than it is on anybody else, and that makes the condition worse, which makes it harder to treat afterwards. Is that really the outcome that we're looking for? And then how we can do reentry in a way that hooks people to services in a meaningful way and prevents a revolving door back into the prison system. So we've been doing this, we've been carrying this out, using basic ADA reasonable modification requirements. So reasonable modification for police is to use de-escalation, to use mobile crisis teams, to use CIT, to make those connections and divert from arrest there. For jails, it's to not use solitary confinement on people with mental illness, because they probably didn't violate the rule intentionally, and because it's not going to help in the long run for them to comply with the rules in the future. And using reentry as a way to coordinate with community-based mental health services. All that's ADA reasonable modification. But the piece that's been missing until recently is, oh, who do we connect them to? Where's the CIT? Where's the ACT team? Where's the de-escalation training? How do I make a warm handoff to a community-based service that's not there? So we've done settlements about police and jails and others in a number of places that all emphasize this diversion using de-escalation techniques and CIT and re-entry programs. And now we're following those up with Olmstead cases. So we settled with the Portland Police Bureau. They have a committee that will now bring providers and advocates together to figure out how to divert people and make those warm handoffs to services. And then we went to the Oregon State and said, you need to fix your mental health system, so community-based services are there. And we've reached both those agreements now, and they're working in beautiful tandem. Similarly, in Mississippi, we went to the Hinds County Jail, reached a settlement agreement with them that requires that coordination with services, and now we've sued Mississippi to make sure those services are there. So that's the things that we're looking at now. Baltimore's the latest. It has explicit findings under the ADA that the police have to use de-escalation techniques and mobile crisis teams and crisis intervention teams in order to divert and de-escalate police interactions. Baltimore has the services in the community, but it's never done the coordination to make sure that they're used. We think these pieces of the ADA, when used together and not treated as silos, that this is the police and we only deal with the police, this is the jail, we only deal with the jail, we'll deal with the whole system and hopefully solve the whole problem until somebody finds a creative way to discriminate in a new way. There's always a creative way to discriminate in a new way, but we're going to clamp down on at least 3 or 4 of them. I'll stop now. I've taken up half of Eric's time.
Thank you very much. That's a great talk. So, questions for Eve and for Eric? Eric?
Hello, it's always a pleasure to be here back at Georgetown Law School where I got my start. And to come after Eve, who's presented such a broad overview of the disability rights field. I think in terms of understanding the challenges and the developments of the law, to see where we are in the United States really helps see how far we've come recently and how much further we have to go on the international sphere. My work at Disability Rights International has very much focused on situations where the most extreme human rights violations take place. Very often for people who are detained in psychiatric facilities, for children who are in orphanages, for adults in nursing homes. And my work very much comes out of the same disability rights movement. I started off before law school working at a place that was then called the Mental Health Law Project, now the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law, that brought some of the first cases to the Supreme Court that really did cutting-edge work to support the legal right to be part of society and to promote the deinstitutionalization of psychiatric facilities and institutions for people with intellectual disabilities. In the United States in the 1950s, we had 500,000 people in institutions. It has been a half a century. Unfortunately, we still have people in institutions, but we've had a more than 95% rate of deinstitutionalization. And while you look out on the street and you see the homeless people with mental illness and the failures of our community system, what you don't see is the great successes. All the people with disabilities who once would have been locked away, who are now part of society. Harder to see the successes, and part of that is really a product of effective disability rights law in the United States. Unfortunately, that revolution that has happened internationally, domestically, has not happened internationally. The problem exists on a vast, vast scale. We know that there are 10 million children in orphanages and other institutions around the world. Studies have shown that orphanages generate disability. They are dangerous places to put children. Children with known obvious disabilities are likely to be placed then in adult facilities and spend their lives in institutions. No international body has even begun to try to grasp the breadth of the problem. And so if we've got 10 million children in orphanages and 2, 3, 4 times that many adults, we're talking 30, 40, 50 million people segregated from society due to outmoded service system and whose basic and fundamental rights have been denied. Whenever I give my talk at Georgetown, I have to go back to how I founded the organization that I did, and the idea, the very core idea, that people with disabilities have the same rights as all others under international law, how I came to that, and how I've been able to make a contribution to that through Disability Rights International. After working at the Mental Health Law Project, I came to Georgetown University with the goal of doing international human rights work. And I was in a human rights seminar here, taught by Professor Juan Mendez, who is now the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. He was himself a torture survivor. He was detained in Argentina. And when we went around the room in my seminar, I said, well, I have this background in mental health, background doing disability rights and deinstitutionalization. And he said, you know, it would be great if you would write your term paper on the international human rights protection for people who are in institutions. Because I have not seen anything done on that. And little did I know at the time, I've now read his autobiography, the enormous emotional impact that the detention that he experienced had not only on him, but as on his family, that he had some very good reasons for asking me to write this paper. Well, I went over to the law library. It was the first year that it was opened over there. And I looked at the literature on human rights and mental health. And what I saw was absolutely amazing. And that was a total blank. This was 1989, 1990. The Berlin Wall fell at this time. The remnants of the Soviet Union were crumbling. But when you looked at mental health and international human rights in the literature, the only thing that you found was the placement of political dissidents in Soviet psychiatric hospitals. And I went and I read those reports. They were done by the World Psychiatric Association. The State Department sent a delegation over with psychiatrists from the National Institute of Mental Health. And the descriptions of these large institutions were eerily similar to what we had been fighting against in the disability rights movement in the United States. They sounded like the same old big long-term psychiatric asylums that we were working on closing. 1,000-bed facilities where people are placed without proper due process. They may never go outside to see the light or air. That they could be forcibly medicated with these horrible psychotropic drugs that had sedative effects on them. And it seemed from these reports that the real abuse was this poor dissident had to be locked away with these mentally ill people, as if it were perfectly okay to do it if you had a true diagnosis of mental illness, and it wasn't the intent of the authorities to do it for political purposes. So I wrote my term paper at the time on the existing international law, and there was almost no, and I will say the one exception to this, was the work that had been done by Larry Gostin at Mind in Britain in the 1970s and early 80s. He had actually brought cases to the European Court of Human Rights challenging the improper detention of people with psychiatric disabilities as a form of arbitrary detention under existing international human rights law. He had challenged the abuse and horrendous conditions in institutions as inhuman and degrading treatment. That path-breaking work, there was a yawning gap. His work was all there was, and it had not been translated into clear international standards, even though the precedent did exist from the European system. I made the argument then that just because it was not the intent of the professional to hurt the person did not mean that it couldn't rise to the level of torture. There was another report by Amnesty International. It was an amazing report done regarding psychiatric detainees in Romania. And these people were subject to electric shock treatment. If you've seen the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, ECT, you're given a surge of electricity to the brain to form a seizure, and it's thought to be a cure for depression. Well, horrible as that experience may be, when it's used in the United States, it's used with anesthesia. In Romania, it was being used with no anesthesia. So you feel the electricity, you're pulled down, you feel the electricity going through your body before you lose consciousness. The one saving grace is that unfortunately ECT causes short-term retrograde amnesia, so most people who experience it can't remember that it happened to them. But for some people do remember it, and certainly all of them do experience the pain before they lose consciousness. And the Amnesty International report said, well, we interviewed the doctors, and the doctors did not mean to hurt the patients, they were trying to help them. And so, because of that, it didn't raise a human rights violation, it raised some ethical concerns about the proper medical ethics of causing pain to people in the process of curing them. So when you look at the international human rights law, the definition of torture is that it has to be an intentional act. It can't just be an act of neglect. But you have to mean to do the act, but you don't have to mean necessarily to cause pain. It has to be an intentional act for the purpose of, and then it lists various purposes. And the normal context in which you're thinking of this is police who pummel someone to get a confession. Right? So it's the purpose of obtaining a confession normally, but it also says for other purposes or for discrimination of any kind. Well, what causes discrimination? I mean, if people are being detained who shouldn't be, if people are being subjected to pain that they would never be subjected to if they hadn't had a disability, why isn't that meet the definition of torture? And I made the argument back in law school that it did. And I can tell you that when I made that argument, I expected to then be able to go to Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and all the big groups and say, look, you've been overlooking torture all this time in psychiatric facilities and these horrible places where these abuses take place. And so when I was graduating from law school and looking for my first job, I knocked on the door of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, and I said, look, here's this horrible abuse, here's the law, let's do something about it. And I remember the first conversation that I had with the head of the medical program of Amnesty International, who said, absolutely not, this does not fit within the mandate of Amnesty International because it's really not torture, essentially going back to the idea that it had to be politically motivated. And if it were true that this was torture, then it would open up the floodgates and there would be so much torture in the world that the protection against torture would now become meaningless. That was the argument he used, why Amnesty could not take a stand on this. So I looked when I founded my organization, right after graduating from law school, I applied for a fellowship from something called Echoing Green. It still exists if any of you are looking for an interesting career after you graduate. It's for the concept of a person, it's a social entrepreneur fellowship, someone with an idea who wants to do something new. And so I got a $20,000 fellowship to create a new organization that would work to protect the international human rights of people with disabilities. I've now been doing this work for 23 years, as a result, our breakthrough report came in the year 2000, when we went in and documented horrendous abuses in Mexican psychiatric facilities. In order to give you the sense of context, I want to see if I can show a short video. Because the abuses that I have seen in psychiatric facilities and orphanages around the world are so beyond, it's hard to fully grasp exactly what the horrors are that are going on in the world today. I think it truly helps to see that. The video that I'm going to show was actually made shortly after I founded the organization, before the United Nations adopted a new UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. So what it does is it shows how the general human rights framework existed at the time, and we'll be able to look from there as to what the incredible change happened as a result of that. We released our report. The government of Mexico was terribly embarrassed. The New York Times Magazine sent in a reporter who did a 16-page spread with incredible photographs from Mexican psychiatric facilities. And the government of Mexico was so embarrassed that, among other things, to polish its international reputation, it thought, well, we can get a little attention off what's going on in our own society. And, well, a nice little distraction would be to sponsor a resolution in the United Nations calling for a treaty on the rights of people with disabilities. That treaty has transformed the world. We now have powerful, very progressive international law protecting the rights of people with disabilities. The challenge now is about enforcement, to get that treaty enforced. But let's take you back 15 years ago to where we were before the treaty and give you a view as to what's going on in those institutions. Can I do a Google search? Witness is an organization that helps human rights groups use video. And, oops, that's, let's see. Yes, I've usually played it out of YouTube. So that's good. Oops, is there no sound?
Jeff, we maybe want to take the break now, and then I can get the IT to help with the sound.
Let's take a break
And then we
now.
can start.
Okay, sounds good.
So we'll plan to come back at 2:35. Thank you.
Yeah.
Grew up on campus at Colloquium Institute.
Oh, really?
My father was on campus primarily. Started around 1982. 97.
Wow.
Part of the
The migration didn't work, the migration. And the weird thing is, I get a
Or, you know, yeah, exactly. And
I saw a pop-up from him, so I noticed that, like,
So
he said he really just.
I
But
realized
other people, I
that
just don't even know what's happening. But
philosophical
anyway, so, but I, like, I started
turn towards
she has a conflict for Henry, I think so.
one of his consensus, but
Still,
oftentimes I
some of
feel
it's just like a first, which is how you're still trying to get hard, stern for the climate.
there are some benefits, like to
So some of them just.
wrong with our especially in cases where it's fairly severe. Some cases, like Alfred Allen was founded out in 1850. At that time, prisons we were relying on machines. And so, kind of utopian situation where all the
So we could ask her, I think, whether we would
all the opportunities were in place. Planning.
Absolutely.
And it kind of concerns me to think that, in a way, there's been you know, it just, the challenge is this, like, one of the things I just, I do talk to, like, undergraduate.
Right, because that happens, when you usually right on top of it.
Well, I realize also, I don't know how this county could be related. Message and email, these are like almost a week.
One of the things I always mention is, like, it's kind of unique interpersonal relationships where everybody had always been treated like, back in their chair. And so that was like common amongst the relationships, see, some of the most giving, altruistic people almost like, is there sort of I strive for the same goals, high-minded goals, and they're better achieving.
You should also be awesome.
And, you know, you're all back.
Because even like, I was technically getting them to
Comparing to one another, the reciprocity is intrinsic, you know, throughout all.
No problem, no problem.
It's the one break, okay. Model for relationships. And it's so hard in a more competitive society just to see like how, you know, just like,
I only know about your torture and mental health.
Yeah, they're all,
Oh, absolutely.
yeah, because I ran into
treated with like special care versus like going to public school where it's like more like competition, you know, especially in the mall schools, you know, everybody's great at curve, it's like one routine. You know, like how could that not be like
yeah, well, I found,
it's not that different. Weeding out individuals that might not be
well,
invested.
my recollection,
Yeah, so I'm wondering,
same
like,
art, torture.
it did occur to me, like, you know, at the ends,
But, no, I think,
what they feel in practice, what extent is this really
ridiculous
necessary?
this person with so much time.
There's sometimes they can hear when it gets to the point.
And they said that I don't medical necessity. It was yet to look at but I saw one And then he wrote the best paper. I thought he like, what's that experiment? He was just like, give it a shot.
Because they just have no stimulation, and any form of feeling becomes better than the nothingness that's the institution. This video would and raw and that is because they just have no stimulation, and any form of feeling becomes better than the nothingness that's the institution.
I had this incredible chair that was wonderful.
The selected of the old bioengineers get rude and selecting it from those making contact.
Finding an open challenge.
During contact.
So I'm really looking into it. And then the other thing is
I mean, you get royalties, you get fans, they don't pay for it.
so I think somebody needs to take a year off. What's his name? I was wondering. I don't feel old. For their purposes, I've been around. But anyway, that anything that would pay for something I would have. And then it ends. I know you were at the World Cup last spring. I'm sorry I couldn't make it. We just need more money from the state. Right. Lights can be turned on for your. Yeah, it really helps because it's kind of hard to see.
Yeah, no worries.
But I can stick my
Before I forget, before we show this, after I mentioned Juan Mendez playing such an important role in my career, he is now doing a report on children in detention and has asked me to do a paper for him on the protection against torture and the right to community integration for children. And so I'm in the home stretch of that, and I'm looking for some research help. So if anybody has some time and wants to do a really fascinating an amazing bit of research to help me out with that over the next few weeks. Please be in touch. All right, let's see. What do I do to get this?
Click on play. Yep,
And it'll start at the beginning?
it will.
I've seen children sticking their fingers in their eye, scratching themselves. You can see bloody tracks where they've scratched their skin raw. And that is because they just have no stimulation, and any form of feeling becomes better than the nothingness that's the institution.
This video reveals the human rights abuses that go unchecked in psychiatric institutions, orphanages, and mental retardation facilities around the world. Eric Rosenthal, the director of Mental Disability Rights International, or MDRI, has conducted investigations in Mexico, Uruguay, Armenia, Russia, Azerbaijan, Ukraine, Hungary, and the former Yugoslavia. He sees recurring problems of cruel and degrading treatment, inadequate attention, and inappropriate institutionalization.
The truth is, most institutions around the world have more similarities than differences. So what we captured in Mexico was not that much different from what I saw in Romania, Hungary, Russia, Ukraine. Rows of beds, totally sterile, these places where people live for the rest of their life and absolutely no sense of individuality whatsoever. One of the hardest things to communicate in a written report is the kind of the abuse of locking up a person in a sterile room and having them sit there do nothing.
Article 7 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights states that no one shall be subjected to torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment.
What does that mean in the context of a person with a psychiatric disability? It means being locked up in a cage. It means being locked up to rot in your own filth. It means being totally lacking in any form of privacy or dignity.
In many of the institutions that MDRI visits, there is no privacy. Every room is communal. The clothes are shared, the bathrooms are filthy, puddles of urine dot the floors, and the conditions are utterly dehumanizing.
Five cups.
There are 5 cups for 99 patients.
99 patients, including some of the women who had urinated over here and had not had a chance to go to the bathroom or clean themselves since then. And some of them have been walking in and sitting in it.
Most of these institutions are severely understaffed and overflowing with people. Medical attention is often inappropriate or hopelessly inadequate. A shockingly common problem is self-abuse. Children and adults, starved of stimulation, hurt themselves to feel something, anything. So staff respond by tying them down for hours on end. In one institution in Mexico, MDRI investigators came across a child strapped down in a wheelchair with sheets wrapped around his body.
No, they're tying it under, they're putting the restraints under the mattress there, so we can't.
Just taking the restraints off the child.
Right.
Put it under the mattress.
Staff do not have time to tend to people or to give them the care they need.
This man has been erected down this hall for the last half an hour naked. And no one seems to be taking any notice of him.
At stake is not just a patient's immediate welfare, but their long-term condition. For young children, starving them of attention will have lifelong consequences.
This little kid is so neat at human contact. Just look at the littlest contact he responds to. And he's just got so much energy and he's walking around.
Activists like Eric Rosenthal see community integration as the answer to many of these problems. For legal precedent, he turns to the 1991 UN Principles for the Protection of Persons with Mental Illness, which state that every person with mental illness shall have the right to live and work to the extent possible in the community. Authorities admit that people are detained in institutions because they have nowhere else to go. Once they are admitted, it is often hard for patients to leave, whether they are fit to or not. The legal mechanisms to protect against arbitrary detention do not exist, or there may be nowhere and no one to release them to. According to the director at one Mexican institution, 80% of the people detained did not need to be there. Faced with tremendous stigma and discrimination and no supportive care in the community, the burden of caring for people with mental disabilities is often left to the family. When they cannot cope and feel they have no choice but to place a relative in an institution, they are often blamed by medical authorities. In Mexico, people placed in institutions by family members are called abandonados. In this unit, there were 15 abandonados.
Of the 15, 12 have been in condition to be discharged for 4 years, and the rest have been in condition for 6 months.
I see. And is it difficult to find their families?
Sí, es muy difícil encontrar sus familias.
It's difficult, as the families are clever and normally don't leave their real address when they bring them for admission. And then, the emotional bonds weaken over time. The close family members, like parents and siblings, start disappearing, and only more distant relatives remain, who definitely don't want to take responsibility for the patients.
In countries of the former Soviet Union, family members have reported to MDRI that doctors told them to give up a disabled child immediately after birth so they would not become too attached to the baby. Many families are heartbroken by the pressure to give up their child and would do anything to keep them at home.
These are children that are waiting for a placement. The family takes them to different psychiatrists, specialists to see if there's any or if they can do anything with them within their homes. And then they are recommended to be taken to different institutions. And the second level is that socially they're not able to have a specialist come to their homes to take care of them. That's why they bring the children to our institutions.
In addition to documenting abuses, MDRI works closely with activists who are working to challenge discrimination and reform laws in their own countries. Gabor Gambos is a Hungarian physicist who founded the Voice of Soul, an advocacy organization made up of psychiatric survivors.
Then we feel that we are not alone. We can share knowledge and expertise, our techniques, how we can influence legislation, how we can improve human rights conditions.
MDRI is fighting for the day when mental disability rights are an accepted part of the international human rights agenda. One significant step in the right direction was taken in March 2000 when MDRI presented the findings of its report on abuses in Mexico's psychiatric facilities to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. As a consequence, for the first time ever, the next annual report of the Commission on Mexico's Human Rights Record raises concerns about conditions in psychiatric facilities there. Shortly after these public hearings, Mexico declared that it would close one of the most abusive institutions. For mental disability activists, it's another step on the road to widespread recognition of some long-ignored basic human rights. For further information on what you can do to help the cause of people in institutions around the world, contact MDRI.
Well, I probably should have warned you that that was going to be a little heavy. I could go into the standards that now exist in the convention, but I often find that after showing that video, it's worth pausing. I know we're going to have a joint Q&A, but if there are any questions about the video or this specific, take a couple now.
How did they let, I've seen those same images when I was younger younger than you. And they would never let me take a photograph, let alone a video.
Yeah.
How did you do it?
Good question. Basically, the concept that these are human beings who have rights is so far from the consciousness of the people who run these institutions that they generally don't even have any idea that there's anything to be ashamed of or to hide. I remember when I first started my work, we went to Hungary. And there was a picture of one of these cages that are built over a bed, a caged bed. I was there in December. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The light was low. It was almost dark out. And we walked into a room, and the nurse was showing around this facility. She flicked on the lights, and there was a room full of 20 people in cages. And the lights were on. People suddenly kind of woke up, and because they couldn't leave their cage to go to the bathroom, they literally had chamber pots in their beds, and many of them knocked them over. They were covered in urine and feces. It was such a vision of horror. And she turns on the light and says, "Here are the behavior problems. They're not human beings; they're behavior problems. Why do you lock them in cages? For their own safety, because there are 92 people in this building and only one nurse to monitor them." No concept at all that there was anything to hide, because this is how people have always been treated. And there's an impact that goes far beyond. I think the fact that the world community has not spoken out about these, it's not just about enforcement of rights. And I think this gets to the core of what international human rights law is. International human rights, what I find in this work is that people are so dehumanized. They are not treated as if they are people at all. They are other. In the Republic of Georgia, I was just there last year, and we did a report at the Tbilisi Infants House, a place where babies were placed. They were literally not given medical care. Children with hydrocephalus, whose heads were getting larger and larger because they had water on the brain. These are medical conditions that can be easily treated with a shunt. And we asked, why have you not given them these treatments? And they said, well, because they're already disabled. And if they're already disabled, their lives are going to be limited, so why bother to give them treatment? We walked out of that building, and there in the middle of the building was a playground with a big sign with the U.S. flag on it, gift to the people of the United States of America. And the United States Agency for International Development, as it does in so many countries, had given the gift of helping them build a playground, while the children inside were dying. If you talk about torture, they're dying without even any pain medication, a slow, painful death, because they were essentially not being treated as human beings. And this is what I see time and time again around the world. So the reason they give us access, nothing to hide. The more we do this work and the more successful, the harder it is to get access. But I've done work in 36 different countries, and so far it's been shamefully easy. Yes.
Can I just ask off the back of that? I'm trying to understand. So are people in those who are running those institutions, do they think they're doing a service to wider society then? Or do they think, you know...
A combination, different motivations, but if you think back to the nurse, where we're locking them up for their own safety, the paternalistic idea, well, if we weren't doing this, they'd be dead. So at least we're keeping them alive. Their expectations for people with disabilities are so low that if you're keeping them alive at all, you're doing them a favor. So you're both doing it for their protection. You know, what's the adage? The road to hell is paved with good intentions. So much, and this is the big challenge in using the torture protection. Going back to that idea of intent and purpose, if the doctors in Romania are giving ECT not to suppress dissidents, but there to help. So it's that medical patina of we are here to treat, to help, to provide care that justifies it. So yes, they're doing the people a favor by torturing them. And are they doing a help to society? At some level, there's clearly an element of social control where they're doing it for society as well.
Yeah, I mean, you've brought a tear to my eye because it brings back a flood of memories for me, and I've been to those places inside the cells with the chamber pots and the urine and the feces. But the one thing that drove into my memory, and I hadn't thought of it in decades, was that there was a young teenage girl with microcephaly, and she was basically in a crib with just a head, virtually just a head. And I would flirt with her. We were like, I was her boyfriend, you know.
Yeah.
She would chat. Never even occurred to me she could be treated. So incredible. I mean, it's a random thought, but it's just.
No,
I just want to.
It's exactly right. You go in there
Yeah.
and you interact with them. They're real human beings, and it's true. It's just that they've been so completely run off. Yeah.
It's the assumption that people with mental health disabilities, or really any kind of disabilities, are so not going to achieve the expectations that we have for other people that we should just write them off. It's not just internationally, it's here. I have a friend who's a lawyer who was, because he had CP in an institution as a 2-year-old, and a nurse happened to notice that he watched her all the time and started to interact with him. And he ends up getting out of the institution, and he's a lawyer, but they were never going to do anything with him. He was in a crib, he was going to be in that crib until he got older, and then he'd graduate to a caged vet. It's everywhere.
Yep. Well, and because I take volunteers on my work, I bring lawyers and judges and mental health professionals abroad, many of whom were the ones who fought against the abuses in the United States when we still had 500,000 people in institutions. One of the things that I've learned is that there is no abuse, not one, that we see abroad that we haven't experienced in the United States. When I said institutions have more similarities than differences, the Justice Department is now doing fabulous work under the Olmstead case, trying to get the remaining people out of institutions, those children in nursing homes in Florida. The facilities may be a little cleaner, but the same dehumanization is ultimately happening. And so I really do believe, and maybe this is a segue for us to both do our joint Q&A, that the challenges are ultimately the same. We're fighting for the same thing, and these abuses happen everywhere. On the international law, I'll just mention one key element. One of the real interesting innovations of the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities is Article 32. Which says that international cooperation and international aid must advance the principles of the convention. So the big challenge in international law is how do you enforce it? You can, like Larry, bring cases to the European Court. We're currently bringing an Olmstead-type case to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. But the idea of leveraging foreign aid as the most powerful way to influence other countries. Because number one, when you put up that sign in the courtyard, gift of the American people, and there are kids dying inside, the symbolic power of that is such that it's saying it's okay to do it this way. And if we can turn that around and take action, we can have vast impact. One of the challenges, one of the things we're trying to do right now is to get the US government, AID, the State Department, A, to adopt a rule saying we're not going to support institutions, because we found that they do all over the world, and B, to try to get them to use what we've learned about deinstitutionalization to try to challenge the problem of the tens of millions of people who are locked in institutions. It's a way you can use the international law to really bring about major international change.
Great. I think now would be good. Why don't we both of you go up? So this was great. Weren't they both great presentations? So now let's just jump in. I told a couple of you at the break, I don't know if you guys are shy or assertive yet, and I'm hoping you're really assertive. So want lots of questions and gave it. Andrew, did you? Oh, I think
yeah, no, I do.
I
sure. Yeah. So actually, I grew up at Elwyn Institute on campus from the ages of about 2 till 12 because my father was the on-campus primary care physician. So I have a really close relationship to a lot of what you're describing. Elwyn, fortunately, was not as egregious as a lot of the institutions that you were referring to. Alfred Elwin founded Elwin in about 1854 as a means to try to bring about, you know, the full potential of individuals with special needs. And, you know, at that time, it was often the jail systems were relied upon as a means of caring for individuals because they were really ostracized. Then I guess in the 90s there was a shift towards the integrative philosophy and trying to, you know, get everybody, give everybody the opportunity to kind of integrate into their own communities and stop this, you know, segregation that was occurring. I think that it was important for one, the visibility of these issues and trying to address them politically. You know, if they're cooped up in these little bins, then we'll never see the problems and we'll never get to address them, as well as the, you know, addressing the stigma that is just right, you know, rampant amongst our own communities. If we never integrate, then we'll never kind of close that gap between the sensitivities of individuals towards those with special needs and, you know, the reality. And so, like, growing up, my father always explained to us that, you know, we're all limited in our capacities. We're all born independent, depending on an individual's care, and we all lapse back into that with some luck, you know, or, you know, if we live till old age, or, you know, with some misfortune if we end up in some kind of accident. And so kind of cultivating this current of care is really crucial to, you know, our own well-being. But I guess in hearing you both speak against the institutionalization, trying to eliminate it is, to me, seems maybe a step too far, because I think that, from my own experience, there was some benefits in having, you know, an institution in place that already had the capacity in place, or the ability to take care of these individuals and give them a destigmatized kind of environment where they could maybe work and find employment. Whereas, like, when integrated, it has been a challenge since the ADA, trying to find, you know, that realization of full employment for individuals with disabilities. And I feel like maybe there could be like a hybrid model. And I was wondering, actually, Eric, if you are wholly against the use of maybe these communities, or if there's a model in which you see they could be used to some benefit but less so, or more monitored or regulated in a manner that would, you know, help ensure the full recognition of these individuals' potential.
Well, Eve may view this differently, and I'm interested in her perspective on it. My perspective actually is that there is no halfway, that we have to go all the way. And indeed, one of the benefits of international human rights law is that it actually goes further than the US law. Article 19 is a flat right for all people with disabilities to live in the community with choices equal to others. So rather than being a right to services or the right to protection against unnecessary institutionalization, the implication is institution is never necessary. We have models. We have places in the world where all institutions have been closed down. So we know that a person with a disability never, ever, ever needs to be institutionalized for their own benefit. The only times that they're institutionalized is when we as a society have failed to create the support systems necessary for them to be part of society. And in terms of, and I know that can be hard to wrap your head around, and it is because, you know, we're fighting for this right internationally when the United States still has people in institutions. So we go abroad and we're saying, oh no, international law calls for the closure of all institutions. How can you as an American say that when you still do it? So
I think you yelled at me about that.
I believe so. So there still are challenges. There absolutely are challenges. I'm interested in your view, but one last point. One of the key, there's some language in Olmsted, and you probably know the language better than me, where it talks about one of the dangers of institutionalization is the perpetuation of the stereotypes themselves. that when you go halfway, when you haven't fully broadened her out, it perpetuates the stereotype that these are lesser human beings who can't quite make it in society. And so I believe that partial deinstitutionalization is still dangerous. And when we have shown that the most disabled people can function in society, it starts to break down the stereotypes that show that all people with disability can be part of society. What's your view?
Well, and I philosophically believe that all people can be served in their communities. But we are not at a point we can only talk about what the law requires. And so I take the law as it is, that people have to be served in the most integrated setting that's appropriate for them. So that takes the convenience of the government entity or the institution out of it, more or less. But it does recognize a balance of resources. So we have to serve a lot of different people, and can we serve more in this way than in this way, and reaching a balance there. And what we try to do is focus on a couple of things that reverse the past trend. We don't say you have to close the institutions. None of our agreements require the closure of institutions. They can be open and almost empty. We disagree over whether there are 2 people who need an institution or 10 people who need an institution. Others claim much larger numbers than that. But we focus on there being a spectrum. To date, we've only offered people institutions. If you need something, here's where you have to go. That's it. Good luck to you. And we recognize that that's often not true. This is not the only place where you could get these services. We want that spectrum to be built out so people can make real choices about what will work best for them. And we want to reverse the presumption that has said, you'll start here in the institution and we'll teach you and do what they call step down. We'll move you from a big institution to a small institution to a 24-hour guard to if you get good enough at each of those steps. And that doesn't work. You don't get good at being integrated by not being integrated. And it also sets up a sort of reverse incentive system where you get good at something and congratulations, you get to go do something else and start all over again. So we're reversing the assumption. So if you look at, say, our Rhode Island agreement about employment and sheltered workshops, we don't say you start with you say you want a sheltered workshop, or that a sheltered workshop is one of the appropriate things and you're going to go to that one. You start with, you're going to try integrated employment. You're actually going to try it at least twice. So you can lose your job twice, or more if you want to, but at least twice, before we're going to say, okay, we'll try something more structured for you, and back from starting at the most integrated setting. Let's see if that works. Let's see if it works a couple of times, because God knows I lost my bank teller job. And that doesn't mean it's the end of your career. It is the end of your career as a bank teller. Thank goodness. But you're gonna work from integrated towards segregated, and almost never do people go all the way to segregated from there. Once you try it, it's like, oh yeah, I can do this, and we can change it this way and make it better. So we're trying to flip those assumptions and demonstrate that nobody needs to be here. Almost nobody needs to be here. But we don't start with the close all the institutions perspective. Institutions in America are legal. They're just only legal if they're the most integrated place that's appropriate for this person. So that's a little different. And then the other thing that we see, and this calls on all of us to do better, is you're integrated, but you're isolated. And that's a terrible thing too. So we've placed you in a community setting, but we haven't set up any way for you to make friends. We haven't found ways for you to engage with people without disabilities in a normal situation. We've always got some third party watching you, or you're always moving around in enclaves or groups of other people with disabilities. And so we really have to work on all of that as a society, being open to the people in our neighborhood who are different from us, and engaging with them, and getting away from another sort of institutional approach to integrating, which was, they sometimes call it reverse integration, where you bring the people without disabilities in to see the people in the disability gated community or the disability farm, And that feels a little too much like going to see the zoo. So we go in and watch them and think, oh, how interesting. And that's not any kind of real engagement that the rest of us get. We don't have people who are different from us come in and look at us and say, wow, how interesting is that? They wouldn't say that about my life anyway, but we're trying to get away from that. That is an integration. That's a spectacle. So those are some of the things we try to work on.
So why don't we take a couple more questions and let them answer? Chris?
Yeah, one of the questions I have for you, Ms. Hills, you talked a lot about how technology can be helpful, and one of the things that made me think about it is there are some new technologies like Uber, or Lyft, Airbnb that somewhat blur the line between places of public accommodation and private residences or vehicles. How have you dealt with those sorts of places, and does it present like an issue or a complication for people with disabilities?
Let's take a couple of questions.
Sure.
Otherwise, we're going to.
Then I'll have to remember them.
My name is Laura Torres. I'm Mexican, and I was, as you, Ms. Hills, were presenting, I tried to find an equivalent within the Mexican government that did the work that your office does, and I couldn't. So my question is, how does the Department of Justice spots the problems? Do you have a systematic surveillance system, or through complaints, or?
Okay.
And one more. Yes, in the back.
Thank you both very much for your talk. One thing I was interested in is, I'm a physician myself, working with people with physical and mental disabilities, even in places where philosophically the ADA is a revered concept and fully part of the philosophy of the organisation, and where the right to health and the right to health in the community is upheld. You then have the limitation of what the health system itself offers and what resources are available to then enact those rights in community. And I think, Eve, in your talk you mentioned taking from one of your Olmsted cases, then working with the health system to actually look at how they engage that. And I was really interested if you could comment more on, from a legal perspective, kind of the enforcement then of not only the human right to access this, but then engaging with the health system to enforce the resourcing of that right.
So either one can jump in first, answer whichever one.
Well, Uber and Lyft and Airbnb. This has clearly raised a bunch of disability issues. Uber has been sued a number of times. I think Lyft has been sued once. Airbnb I don't think has been sued yet, but people are looking at it, and they've started with the racial discrimination piece, and they have not gotten to the disability discrimination piece, which is arguably, well, which is probably a little more complicated. Uber and Lyft we treat them, and we've said this in a brief, as a private transportation provider. And we've gotten into a little bit the issue of whether they can say, no, we're not a private transportation provider, we're just a platform where private transportation providers share their services. And we don't agree with that. We think they are private transportation providers. So they have the same obligations that taxis have, basically. They can't keep out blind people. They can't keep out the service dog. Enforcement of that is a little difficult. So can I enforce it directly against Uber or Lyft? I would say so. I could also enforce it directly against the driver, because at that point they are providing a service for money, and that makes them a private transportation provider also. So there are a couple of levels there. But there are a number of things. Part of it is you can't discriminate against people with disabilities, but does Uber or Lyft have to have accessible vehicles? That's another question. And just like taxis are, the requirements for them to have accessible vehicles are fairly limited. They have to have accessible vehicles. When they buy new vans, they have to buy accessible vans, large vans, not the minivans. So you've seen how many accessible taxis there are. Not a lot, and the ones that there are have been primarily sponsored or forced by state law or local law, like in DC DC stepped in and said, we'll give you the cab, you drive it. So it requires, in order to change those systems, it requires both the federal overlay and some sort of state and local intervention as well. Airbnb is a little different in that they are not contracting as much, and I haven't done research into Airbnb, but I can see these ideas playing out. So would Airbnb have any obligation to make sure that there are a certain number of accessible offerings? That would be really very difficult for them since they don't control, they don't go out and seek the offerings and identify, they don't own them, they can't change them in any of those ways. So it's a little more like those shared condo pieces, which have had vacation condos, which are complicated under the ADA and have some obligations, but not, they don't work as neatly as a hotel system does. The provider, I think, may have some obligations under the ADA as like a hotel would. But that wouldn't necessarily require one person who owns one apartment who wants to rent that out on Airbnb to make that apartment accessible. It might require them to say that it's accessible if it is, which would be a good thing. And then there's going to be the same kinds of discrimination that are alleged against people of various races will be almost certainly happening to people with disabilities as well, if you can tell that from the profile. And I don't know if Airbnb's recent moves towards interfering with discrimination or putting barriers up to discrimination are thinking about disability yet. It's just happened, so I'm not sure. So all those sort of platforms and online services have those similar questions that are still being worked out. And similar, there are all kinds of other things. They're talking about autonomous vehicles, which I'm sure Henry would have talked about if he were here. Now those have a huge, like other technologies, world of possibilities for people with disabilities, blind people, for people who have mobility impairments, who would otherwise need a modified vehicle. There could more easily be modified vehicles. There could be more easily be autonomous vehicles that were easier for people who use wheelchairs to drive. If you start with the clean slate and not with the slate that requires a driver with 2 arms and 2 legs and 2 eyes to be in the passenger seat. And unfortunately, regulation about safety is starting with that as our model. So it's sort of limiting the ability to think out of the box on how you could make these things more accessible to people with disabilities. How do we find problems? Oh, they're just everywhere. We do a combination of things. We take complaints because the disability community has a right to say what's important, right? I'm not going to say what's important for people who don't have my kind of disability. So we want to hear from people with disabilities. But we try to play our role in dealing with disability-related discrimination. There's tons of it. But there are a bunch of entities that can do something about it. So there are funding agencies who can take away funding if they're the ones who fund it. So we try to make sure that they do the complaints, we refer the complaints to them when they've got a bigger hook than we do. We try to do complaints that are more resource intensive than, say, a nonprofit disability rights organization can do. We try to do cases that will resolve a law because we get more deference in the courts than individuals do. So we try to make sure that legal aid and nonprofits and advocates and everybody, other agencies, all are playing their role. And then we can also not just act on a complaint, but act on a systemic thing. Whether we see it through complaints or not, we can open compliance reviews into issues that we know are a problem and that we know need to be resolved or addressed at the front end or in a bigger way than a smaller agency would be able to do. And there's also I encourage people to rat on their neighbor. So businesses will turn each other in, and other states will say, I've been doing what you tell me, but the state next door is not doing it.
To put a brief international spin on it, I actually just brought in a group of visitors from Ukraine and Georgia who spent Monday with your colleagues at the Justice Department. And when they heard that her office, which is part of the federal government, sues the government to enforce disability. They were like, does not compute. You mean the United States government sues itself? And so in terms of us having a rights mechanism, that is one of the most mind-bending ones for foreigners to understand. And so there are actually international standards requiring every government of the world to monitor places of detention. And the Disability Convention happens to have some of the most detailed requirements for oversight, both of institutions and of community programs, age-specific, gender-specific protections in each area. And so that monitoring and oversight is definitely now part of international law. I can tell you the head of the DIF, the Children and Families Authority in Mexico, said, when we said, well, all right, now, well, what has the oversight produced? How many children are in your institutions? And he said, well, actually, our service system is a black hole. So in terms of how far we have to go, step one, finding them. And so the oversight just is unbelievably important.
And it helps to have a UN rapporteur on torture call, email it, write you and say, you know, this sounds like torture, what are you doing about it? So other international organizations can put pressure on the United States as well. And then enforcement engagement with the healthcare profession and systems. I mean, part of what we do in that area is the Olmstead stuff. And that is often less about us going to the mental health system or the IDD system and saying, you got to do better. It's more going to the governor. So we sue the state. And so the state can't come back and say, well, our mental health budget is only so much. Because we go, yeah, who sets that? Fix it now. So we get that kind of leverage, which most people can't do. And then interacting with the mental health system, or any kind of system, agency, government type system, they mostly want to do the right thing, but haven't kept up with what the best practices are or the emerging practices. And so we can often, as we proceed with them, give them examples. We bring in experts and technical assistance providers who really know, often people who've been directors of these types of agencies before, to say, oh yeah, this is how you can do it. And then we follow behind saying, she said how, and we're just saying, do it. The more individualized medical profession is a tougher nut to crack. Because each one, that's why we're doing the barrier-free healthcare initiative, because we wanted more of a leveraging effect. Doing something with one doctor doesn't get all the other doctors to pay attention. So we've talked to the Journal of the American Medical Association about what's going on here and want to educate doctors about a lot of things that they're not clear about. Why can't I charge for an interpreter? Why do I have to pay for an interpreter that costs more than this person's appointment will get me? And we have to talk about why that's an overhead expense. And you break it out just like lights and air conditioning across all your patients. I'm getting asked all these questions about percent disability. How does that interact with the ADA? And we basically go, it doesn't. And we are getting asked all these, how does the employer accommodate this person? And I ask them, well, how would you know that? And they go, I don't. You don't know that. All you know is what they can and cannot do. And we're really trying to get to, not we at the Justice Department, because this isn't a legal requirement, but the disability rights community is trying to get to medical professionals who are often the first people that a person with a disability or that a parent of a child with a disability interacts with. And right now, their whole talk to that person is about what this child will not be able to do, what you will not be able to do, what's never going to happen for you. And they're not right. Those expectations are not right. They don't know all the technology. They don't know what the services are. They don't know how things happen. They don't know about the IDEA. So we're trying to get doctors to reach out to specialists or reach out to peers with these disabilities, make connections with community services and independent living centers and so forth to talk to people who really lived it. We see time after time, well, this person will never be able to go to college. Well, they are. They're in law school now, and you can do it. Here's the way to do it. This person will never be able to talk. Well, they got an assistive speech board, and they now talk. So trying to shape that initial conversation is really, really important, because the medical profession has a lot of power, mostly coming out of the medical model of disability, but it's not the how you live with a disability kind of knowledge that they have. I don't know if that answered your question.
On an international level, the issues are strikingly similar, and yet, when you step back and look at some of the challenges abroad, you suddenly start to appreciate the incredibly important, if glacially slow, but incredibly important changes in the United States. The very fact, the idea that the doctor has the right to decide on your treatment. We may have paternalistic doctors, but the concept of choice, and that it's the individual's choice, does not exist in many parts of the world. The International Disability Convention happens to have some very powerful new language. Article 12 on the right to legal capacity establishes the idea that legal capacity is a universal right that people with and without disabilities have. And if you have difficulty making choices, instead of the legal system taking away your right, you have a right no matter what, and it is society's job to provide you with support in making that decision. It can't be taken away, you have to be helped to make that right. In practice, what you're up against are medical professionals who assume they know what's in their best interest and that they can do it, and when we work on enforcing the right to legal capacity, getting beyond that is an enormous challenge.
So unfortunately, I think we're at time. I want to thank both of our presenters. They were both great. Thank you very much. Also, thank you for what you do.
You're welcome to take those.
Great. And we'll see you next week.
Thank you.